Benjamin Harrison was an American politician and lawyer who served as the 23rd President of the United States from 1889 to 1893. He was the grandson of the 9th President, William Henry Harrison, creating the only grandfather-grandson duo to hold the office. Before ascending to the presidency, Harrison established himself as a prominent local attorney, Presbyterian church leader, and politician in Indianapolis, Indiana. During the American Civil War, he served in the Union Army as a colonel, and on February 14, 1865, was confirmed by the U.S. Senate as a brevet brigadier general of volunteers. Effective January 23, 1865, Harrison unsuccessfully ran for governor of Indiana in 1876. The Indiana General Assembly elected Harrison to a 6-year term in the U.S. Senate, where he served from March 4, 1881, to March 4, 1887. A Republican, Harrison was elected to the presidency in 1888, defeating the Democratic incumbent, Grover Cleveland. Hallmarks of Harrison's administration included unprecedented economic legislation, including the McKinley Tariff, which imposed historic protective trade rates, and the Sherman Antitrust Act. Harrison also facilitated the creation of the National Forest Reserves through an amendment to the Land Revision Act of 1891. During his administration, 6 Western states were admitted to the Union. In addition, Harrison substantially strengthened and modernized the U.S. Navy and conducted an active foreign policy. But his proposals to secure federal education funding as well as voting rights enforcement for African Americans were unsuccessful, due in large part to surplus revenues from the tariffs. Federal spending reached $1 billion for the first time during his term. The spending issue in part led to the defeat of the Republicans in the 1890 midterm elections. Cleveland defeated Harrison for re-election in 1892. Due to the growing unpopularity of the high tariff and high federal spending, Harrison returned to private life and his law practice in Indianapolis. In 1900, Harrison represented the Republic of Venezuela in an international case against the United Kingdom. Harrison traveled to Europe as part of the case, and after a brief stay returned to Indianapolis. He died at his home in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1901 of complications from influenza. Although many have praised Harrison's commitment to African Americans as voting rights, scholars and historians generally regard his administration as below average, and rank him in the bottom half among U.S. presidents. Historians, however, have not questioned Harrison's commitment to personal and official integrity. Family and education. Harrison's paternal ancestors were the Harrison family of Virginia, whose immigrant ancestor, Benjamin Harrison, arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, in 1630. Benjamin, the future president, was born on August 20, 1833, in North Bend, Ohio, the second of Elizabeth Ramsey, Irwin, and John Scott Harrison's 8 children. Benjamin was also a grandson of U.S. President William Henry Harrison, the first governor of the Indiana Territory, and a great-grandson of Benjamin Harrison V., a Virginia planter who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and succeeded Thomas Jefferson as governor of Virginia. Harrison was 7 years old when his grandfather was elected U.S. president, but he did not attend the inauguration. Benjamin Harrison's early schooling took place in a log cabin near his home. In 1850, Harrison transferred to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and graduated in 1852. Marriage and early career. After his college graduation in 1852, Harrison studied law with Judge Bellamy Storer of Cincinnati. But before he completed his studies, he returned to Oxford, Ohio, to marry Caroline Scott. Harrison and his wife, Caroline, returned to live at the Point, his father's farm in southeastern Ohio. While he finished his law studies, Harrison was admitted to the bar in early 1854. The same year he sold property that he had inherited after the death of an aunt for $800 and used the funds to move with Caroline to Indianapolis, Indiana. Having grown up in a Whig household, Harrison initially favored that party's politics, but joined the Republican Party shortly after its formation in 1856 and campaigned on behalf of the Republican presidential candidate, John C. Fremont. In 1858, Harrison entered into a law partnership with William Wallace to form the law office of Wallace and Harrison. Civil War. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued a call for more recruits for the Union Army. Harrison wanted to enlist, but worried about how to support his young family. Morton asked Harrison if he could help recruit a regiment. Although he would not ask him to serve, Harrison recruited throughout northern Indiana to raise a regiment. Morton offered him the command, but Harrison declined, as he had no military experience. He was initially commissioned as a captain and company commander on July 22, 1862. Governor Morton commissioned Harrison as a colonel on August 7, 1862, and the newly formed 70th Indiana was mustered into federal service on August 12, 1862. Once mustered, the regiment left Indiana to join the Union Army at Louisville, Kentucky. For much of its first 2 years, the 70th Indiana performed reconnaissance duty and guarded railroads in Kentucky and Tennessee. In 1864, Harrison and his regiment joined William T. Sherman's Atlanta campaign and moved to the front lines. On January 2, 1864, Harrison was promoted to command the 1st Brigade of the 1st Division of the 20th Corps. He commanded the brigade at the battles of Resaca, Cassville, New Hope Church, Lost Mountain, Kennesaw Mountain, Marietta, Peachtree Creek and Atlanta. When Sherman's main force began its march to the sea, Harrison's brigade was transferred to the District of Etowah and participated in the Battle of Nashville. On January 23, 1865, President Lincoln nominated Harrison to the grade of brevet brigadier general of volunteers, to rank from that date, and the Senate confirmed the nomination on February 14, 1865. Post-war career. Indiana politics. While serving in the Union Army in October 1864, Harrison was once again elected reporter of the Supreme Court of Indiana, although he did not seek the position, and served as the court's reporter for 4 more years. The position was unsalaried and not a politically powerful one, but it did provide Harrison with a steady income for his work preparing and publishing court opinions, which he sold to the legal profession. Indiana 1868 President Ulysses South Grant appointed Harrison to represent the federal government in a civil suit filed by Lambton P. Milligan, whose controversial wartime conviction for treason in 1864 led to the landmark U.S. Supreme Court case known as Ex parte Milligan. With his increasing reputation, local Republicans urged Harrison to run for Congress. He initially confined his political activities to speaking on behalf of other Republican candidates, a task for which he received high praises from his colleagues. In 1876, when a scandal forced the original Republican nominee, Goodlove Steinorth, to drop out of the gubernatorial race, Harrison accepted the Republican Party's invitation to take his place on the ticket. When United States Senator Morton died in 1878, the Republicans nominated Harrison to run for the seat, but the party failed to gain a majority in the state legislature, which at that time elected senators. The Democratic majority elected Daniel W. Voorhees instead. He was instrumental in breaking a deadlock on candidates, and James A. Garfield won the nomination. United States Senator. After Harrison led Indiana's Republican delegation at the 1880 Republican National Convention, he was considered the state's presumptive candidate for the U.S. Senate. Harrison served in the Senate from March 4, 1881, to March 4, 1887 and chaired the U.S. Senate Committee on Transportation Routes to the Seaboard and the U.S. Senate Committee on Territories. In 1881, the major issue confronting Senator Harrison was the budget surplus. Democrats wished to reduce the tariff and limit the amount of money the government took in. Republicans instead wished to spend the money on internal improvements and pensions for Civil War veterans. Harrison took his party's side and advocated for generous pensions for veterans and their widows. In 1884, Harrison and Gresham competed for influence at the 1884 Republican National Convention. The delegation ended up supporting James G. Blaine, the eventual nominee. In 1885, the Democrats redistricted the Indiana state legislature, which resulted in an increased Democratic majority in 1886, despite an overall Republican majority statewide. Election of 1888. Nomination. The initial favorite for the Republican nomination was the previous nominee, James G. Blaine of Maine. After Blaine wrote several letters denying any interest in the nomination, his supporters divided among other candidates, with John Sherman of Ohio as the leader among them. Harrison placed fifth on the first ballot, with Sherman in the lead, and the next few ballots showed little change. Election over Cleveland. Harrison's opponent in the general election was incumbent President Grover Cleveland. Harrison reprised a more traditional front porch campaign, abandoned by his immediate predecessors. He received visiting delegations to Indianapolis and made 90-plus pronouncements from his hometown. Although he had made no political bargains, his supporters had given many pledges upon his behalf. When boss Matthew Key of Pennsylvania, who rebuffed for a cabinet position for his political support during the convention, heard that Harrison ascribed his narrow victory to Providence, Key exclaimed that Harrison would never know how close a number of men were compelled to approach the penitentiary to make him president. Quote, Presidency 1889–1893. Inauguration and Cabinet. Harrison was sworn into office on Monday, March 4, 1889 by Chief Justice Melville Fuller. Harrison's inauguration ceremony took place during a rainstorm in Washington, D.C. Outgoing U.S. President Grover Cleveland attended the ceremony and held an umbrella over Harrison's head as he took the oath of office. His speech was brief, half as long as that of his grandfather, William Henry Harrison, whose speech holds the record for the longest inaugural address of a U.S. president. John Phillips Osa's Marine Corps band played at the inaugural ball inside the Pension Building with a large crowd attending. Harrison acted quite independently in selecting his cabinet, much to the dismay of the Republican bosses. He began by delaying the presumed nomination of James G. Blaine as Secretary of State so as to preclude Blaine's involvement in the formation of the administration, as had occurred in President Garfield's term. In June 1890, Harrison's Postmaster General John Wanamaker and several Philadelphia friends purchased a large new cottage at Cape May Point for Harrison's wife Caroline. Civil service reform and pensions. Civil service reform was a prominent issue following Harrison's election. Harrison had campaigned as a supporter of the merit system, as opposed to the spoils system. Harrison quickly saw the enactment of the Dependent and Disability Pension Act in 1890, a cause he had championed while in Congress. One of the first appointments Harrison was forced to reverse was that of James S. Clarkson as an assistant postmaster. Clarkson, who had expected a full cabinet position, began sabotaging the appointment from the outset, gaining the reputation for decapitating a fourth-class postmaster every 3 minutes. Clarkson himself stated, "I am simply on detail from the Republican committee. I am most anxious to get through this task and leave." Quote, he resigned in September 1890. Tariff. Harrison and the billion-dollar Congress are portrayed as wasting the surplus in this cartoon from Puck. The tariff levels had been a major political issue since before the Civil War, and they became the most dominant matter of the 1888 election. Representative William McKinley and Senator Nelson W. Aldrich framed the McKinley tariff that would raise the tariff even higher, including making some rates intentionally prohibitive. Antitrust laws and the currency. Senator John Sherman worked closely with Harrison, writing bills regulating monopolies and monetary policy. Members of both parties were concerned with the growth of the power of trusts and monopolies, and one of the first acts of the 51st Congress was to pass the Sherman Antitrust Act, sponsored by Senator John Sherman of Ohio. One of the most volatile questions of the 1880s was whether the currency should be backed by gold and silver, or by gold alone. The silver coinage issue had not been much discussed in the 1888 campaign, and Harrison is said to have favored a bimetallist position. Civil rights. The colored people did not intrude themselves upon us. They were brought here in chains and held in communities where they are now chiefly bound by a cruel slave code. When and under what conditions is the black man to have a free ballot? When is he in fact to have those full civil rights which have so long been his in law? When is that quality of influence which our form of government was intended to secure to the electors to be restored? In many parts of our country where the colored population is large, the people of that race are by various devices deprived of any effective exercise of their political rights and of many of their civil rights. The wrong does not expend itself upon those whose votes are suppressed. Every constituency in the Union is wronged. He severely questioned the state's civil rights records, arguing that if states have the authority over civil rights, then we have a right to ask whether they are at work upon it. Quote, national forests. That the President of the United States may, from time to time, set apart and reserve, in any state or territory having public land bearing forests, in any part of the public lands wholly or in part covered with timber or undergrowth, whether of commercial value or not, as public reservations, and the President shall, by public proclamation, declare the establishment of such reservations and the limits thereof. Within a month of the enactment of this law, Harrison authorized the first forest reserve to be located on public domain adjacent to Yellowstone Park in Wyoming. Other areas were so designated by Harrison, bringing the first forest reservations total to 22 million acres in his term. Native American policy. During Harrison's administration, the Lakota Sioux, previously confined to reservations in South Dakota, grew restive under the influence of Wivoka, a medicine man, who encouraged them to participate in a spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance. Technology and naval modernization. During Harrison's time in office, the United States was continuing to experience advances in science and technology. Harrison was the earliest president whose voice is known to be preserved. That 36-second recording, "Help! Info," was originally made on a wax phonograph cylinder in 1889 by Johnny Bettini. Over the course of his administration, Harrison marshaled the country's technology to clothe the nation with a credible naval power. When he took office, there were only 2 commissioned warships in the Navy. In his inaugural address, he said, "Construction of a sufficient number of warships and their necessary armaments should progress as rapidly as is consistent with care and perfection." Quote, foreign policy. Latin America and Samoa. Harrison and Secretary of State Blaine were often not the most cordial of friends, but harmonized in an aggressive foreign policy and commercial reciprocity with other nations. In 1889, the United States, the United Kingdom and the German Empire were locked in a dispute over control of the Samoan Islands. Historian George H. Ryden's research indicates Harrison played a key role in determining the status of this Pacific outpost by taking a firm stand on every aspect of Samoa Conference negotiations. This includes selection of the local ruler, refusal to allow an indemnity for Germany, as well as the establishment of a three-power protectorate, a first for the U.S. These arrangements facilitated the future dominant power of the U.S. in the Pacific. Secretary of State Blaine was absent due to complication of lumbago. European embargo of U.S. pork. Throughout the 1880s, various European countries had imposed a ban on importation of United States pork out of an unconfirmed concern of trichinosis. At issue was over 1 billion pounds of pork products with a value of $80 million annually. Harrison engaged Whitelaw Reid, Minister to France, and William Walter Phelps, Minister to Germany, to restore these exports for the country without delay. Harrison also successfully asked the Congress to enact the Meat Inspection Act to eliminate the accusations of product compromise. The president also partnered with Agriculture Secretary Rusk to threaten Germany with retaliation by initiating an embargo in the U.S. against Germany's highly demanded beet sugar. By September 1891, Germany relented, and was soon followed by Denmark, France and Austria-Hungary. Crises in Aleutian Islands and Chile. The first international crisis Harrison faced arose from disputed fishing rights on the Alaskan coast. Canada claimed fishing and sealing rights around many of the Aleutian Islands, in violation of U.S. law. In 1891, a diplomatic crisis emerged in Chile, otherwise known as the Baltimore Crisis. The American minister to Chile, Patrick Egan, granted asylum to Chileans who were seeking refuge during the 1891 Chilean Civil War. Egan, previously a militant Irish immigrant to the U.S., was motivated by a personal desire to thwart Great Britain's influence in Chile. His action increased tensions between Chile and the United States, which began in the early 1880s when Secretary Blaine had alienated the Chileans in the War of the Pacific. The crisis began in earnest when sailors from the USS Baltimore took shore leave in Valparaiso and a fight ensued, resulting in the deaths of 2 American sailors and the arrest of 36 others. Tensions increased to the brink of war. Harrison threatened to break off diplomatic relations unless the United States received a suitable apology, and said the situation required grave and patriotic consideration. The president also remarked, "If the dignity as well as the prestige and influence of the United States are not to be wholly sacrificed, we must protect those who in foreign ports display the flag or wear the colors." Quote, annexation of Hawaii. In the last days of his administration, Harrison dealt with the issue of Hawaiian annexation. Following a coup d'etat against Queen Liliuokalani, the new government of Hawaii led by Sanford Dole petitioned for annexation by the United States. Cabinet. Front row, left to right: Harrison, William Windom, John Wanamaker, Redfield Proctor, James G. Blaine. Judicial appointments. Supreme Court. Harrison appointed 4 justices to the Supreme Court of the United States. The first was David Josiah Brewer, a judge on the Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit. Brewer, the nephew of Justice Field, had previously been considered for a cabinet position. Other courts. In addition to his Supreme Court appointments, Harrison appointed 10 judges to the Courts of Appeals, 2 judges to the Circuit Courts, and 26 judges to the District Courts. Because Harrison was in office when Congress eliminated the Circuit Courts in favor of the Courts of Appeals, he and Grover Cleveland were the only 2 presidents to have appointed judges to both bodies. States admitted to the Union. Vacations and travel. Harrison attended a grand, 3-day centennial celebration of George Washington's inauguration in New York City on April 30, 1889, and made the following remarks: "We have come into the serious but always inspiring presence of Washington. He was the incarnation of duty, and he teaches us today this great lesson, that those who would associate their names with events that shall outlive a century can only do so by high consecration to duty. Self-seeking has no public observance or anniversary." Quote, the Harrisons made many trips out of the capital, which included speeches at most stops, including Philadelphia, New England, Indianapolis and Chicago. The president typically made his best impression speaking before large audiences, as opposed to more intimate settings. During the hot Washington summers, the Harrisons took refuge in Deer Park, Maryland and Cape May Point, New Jersey. In 1890, John Wanamaker joined with other Philadelphia devotees of the Harrisons and made a gift to them of a summer cottage at Cape May. Harrison, though appreciative, was uncomfortable with the appearance of impropriety. A month later, he paid Wanamaker $10,000 as reimbursement to the donors. Nevertheless, Harrison's opponents made the gift the subject of national ridicule, and Mrs. Harrison and the president were vigorously criticized. Reelection campaign in 1892. The Treasury surplus had evaporated and the nation's economic health was worsening. Precursors to the eventual panic of 1893. It was clear that Harrison would not be renominated unanimously. The Democrats renominated former President Cleveland, making the 1892 election a rematch of the one 4 years earlier. The tariff revisions of the past 4 years had made imported goods so expensive that now many voters shifted to the reform position. Harrison's wife Caroline began a critical struggle with tuberculosis earlier in 1892. In 2 weeks before the election, on October 25, it took her life. Caroline died next to her 2 cats, Snowball and Sweetness. Cleveland ultimately won the election by 277 electoral votes to Harrison's 145, and also won the popular vote by 556, 918 to 176, 108. This was the most decisive presidential election in 20 years. It gave Harrison the distinction of being the only president whose predecessor and successor were the same man. Post-presidency and death. After he left office, Harrison visited the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in June 1893. After the expo, Harrison returned to his home in Indianapolis. Harrison had been elected a Companion of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States in 1882, and was elected as Commander-President of the Ohio Commandery on May 3, 1893. For a few months in 1894, Harrison lived in San Francisco, California, where he gave law lectures at Stanford University. From July 1895 to March 1901, Harrison served on the Board of Trustees of Purdue University, where Harrison Hall, a dormitory, was named in his honor. In 1899, Harrison attended the First Peace Conference at The Hague. In 1896, Harrison at age 62 remarried to Mary Scott Lord Dimmock, the widowed 37-year-old niece and former secretary of his deceased wife. Harrison's 2 adult children, Russell, 41 years old at the time, and Mary, Mamie, Mickey, 38, disapproved of the marriage and did not attend the wedding. Benjamin and Mary had one child together, Elizabeth. In 1900, Harrison served as an attorney for the Republic of Venezuela in their British Guiana boundary dispute with the United Kingdom. Harrison developed what was thought to be influenza, then referred to as grippe. In February 1901, he was treated with steam vapor inhalation and oxygen, but his condition worsened. He died from pneumonia at his home in Indianapolis on Wednesday, March 13, 1901, at the age of 67. Harrison's remains are interred in Indianapolis's Crown Hill Cemetery, next to the remains of his first wife, Caroline. After her death in 1948, Mary Dimmock Harrison, his second wife, was buried beside him. Historical reputation and memorials. According to historian R. Hal Williams, Harrison had widespread reputation for personal and official integrity. Following the Panic of 1893, Harrison became more popular in retirement. More recently, historians have recognized the importance of the Harrison administration, and Harrison himself, in the new foreign policy of the late 19th century. The administration faced challenges throughout the hemisphere, in the Pacific, and in relations with the European powers, involvements that would be taken for granted in the 21st century. Harrison's presidency belongs properly to the 19th century, but he clearly pointed the way to the modern presidency that would emerge under William McKinley. Harrison was memorialized on several postage stamps. The first was a 13-cent stamp issued on November 18, 1902. In 1908, the people of Indianapolis erected the Benjamin Harrison Memorial Statue, created by Charles Niehaus and Henry Bacon, in honor of Harrison's lifetime achievements as military leader, U.S. Senator, and President of the United States. In 1942, a Liberty ship, the SS Benjamin Harrison, was named in his honor. In 1951, Harrison's home was opened to the public as a library and museum. It had been used as a dormitory for a music school from 1937 to 1950. Theodore Roosevelt dedicated Fort Benjamin Harrison in the former president's honor in 1906. It is located in Lawrence, Indiana, a northeastern suburb of Indianapolis. The federal government decommissioned Fort Harrison in 1991 and transferred 1,700 of its 2,500 acres to Indiana's state government in 1995 to establish Fort Harrison State Park. The site has been redeveloped to include residential neighborhoods, a golf course,